Circularity is the transition from the materials economy, the fact that actually we should be focusing on resources and carbon and the way that we treat materials in our culture.
Today on the Second Renaissance, Danish architect Lasse Lind from 3XN and GXN pays a visit to the Thinque studio. Lasse's specialisation is in the circular economy and sustainable architecture, and we sit down to explore some of their marquee projects like the Sydney fish markets and Denmark's and Australia's design love affair, what Lasse means by circular behavioural and digital designs, how sustainable architecture can help lower the emissions of the construction industry, which is currently responsible for 1/3 of the world's emissions, biomimicry, closed-loop circularity, GXN's canary in the coal mine innovation, Lasse's design mentors and inspirations, and how Lasse's childhood in Danish nature has shaped his aesthetic use of light and power-generating materials. It was an illuminating conversation, and it certainly opened my eyes to how sustainable form and function can not only beautify our urban environment, but also make a significant environmental contribution when our buildings, in the words of Lasse, become cognitive. Now, a few words on pedigree. Lasse Lind is an architect and partner at GXN and 3XN Architects in Copenhagen, where he is head of consultancy. He studied in Prague, Damascus, and at the Royal Danish Academy, Architecture in Hovedstaden, and specialises in sustainability and the circular economy in the construction industry. He also teaches as a guest lecturer at the Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg. Welcome to the Second Renaissance, Lasse. Lasse Lind, välkommen. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Second Renaissance up here in Avalon Beach.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being up here. Yeah.
I feel like the Danes are taking over the northern beaches here. There must be some sort of marriage made in heaven between Denmark and Sydney in some respect. We've got the Danish butcher across the road. I've got my old friend Mika Utzon Popov, who lives here as well, and of course his surname will remind us all that famous Danish architect had a very, very pivotal role in Sydney Opera House. But what brings you to Sydney and Australia, Lasse?
Yeah, besides the great weather and the nice beaches, as an office, we've been working in Sydney in many years. And I personally started coming here in Sydney a lot 6 years ago when we were sort of in competition for the Sydney fish market. And we've sort of since established an office here with 20 people, and we've been around for 6 years as a kind of proper office here. As one of the partners based out of Copenhagen, I come here as much as I can to sort of support the studio, and there's a lot of seems to be a lot of great things happening in sort of the built environment in Sydney and Australia, and a lot of things sort of ripe for change, I would say. So it's a good time for me to come. I'm happy to be here.
So what are the so we obviously know about the Sydney Opera House and its linkage with Denmark and Utzon coming here for many years, and now it's this iconic building. But you guys are at 3XN and GXN, which is the innovation arm of 3XN. You're really sort of reshaping, I guess, the next generation of Australian buildings down in Circular Quay and at Sydney Fish Markets. Do you want to just tell us a little bit what's going on there?
Yeah, sure.
And maybe about how circular design and sustainability are playing a part in these buildings as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were fortunate enough to win the so-called EMP tower on Circular Quay. I think it was maybe 8 years ago in an international architecture competition. It is actually the first high-rise we've ever done as an office. And the reason why we got invited, I think at that point, or because we were not high-rise architects, we hadn't done it before, and we were competing against much larger international practices. But the client had seen a lot of our low-rise commercial buildings that has a heavy focus on community building through architecture, shared amenity spaces, and very sort of social aspirations of architects and how architecture can bring people together. And they liked that. And they basically asked us, can you do that in a high rise? And so if anyone of the listeners know the project, it's basically 5 stacked boxes. So it's essentially 5 low-rise office buildings stacked into a tower, giving it that more kind of human scale identity within a high-rise building. And I think that's the reason why we essentially won that project, and the clients sort of took a risk on sort of unexperienced high-rise architects as we were at that point. And the circular aspect is that there was an existing building from the 70s on site, an existing high-rise that we sort of built on. So essentially, we've built the new building as it is, or as it looks, on the bones of an existing buildings from the 70s, and actually reused, I think it's 68% of the original structure to build the new structure, which is obviously a kind of a pretty massive carbon saving as opposed to knocking everything down and building anew. So that's kind of it's quite a kind of flagship project for us in many ways. I think it's probably the first project in the world of that scale to do that, to basically graft on a new building on an existing building, in that scale and complexity. So it's obviously a project that we are immensely proud of, and I think also, to be honest, the industry in Australia and Sydney can be proud of as well, because we obviously didn't do it alone. We had a lot of local partners, both in designing but also obviously building it. So yeah, in terms of circularity, it's a project that we're really using as an example to say, well, there are these buildings that are, for various reasons, becoming obsolete around the world. A lot of buildings from the 16th, 70s, 80s that are, for different reasons, a lot of the time actually they are unlettable, or people don't like them anymore. They don't have the social amenities or the indoor qualities that you would like from a modern building. Well, we are definitely trying to argue and show through that building, well, you can do new buildings out of old buildings, essentially. So that's a big topic for us, both due to carbon, but also because we think it has a lot of interesting kind of cultural elements as well. How do we actually work with a part of our history, a part of our building stock, which is often sort of unloved? These buildings are often kind of referred to as being ugly or sort of unwanted somehow. But we have a huge amount of buildings from that period. We built a lot from the 60s and forward. So we believe we have to take that quite seriously and try to work with it as resources for what we want to do in kind of society now with those types of buildings.
Yeah, amazing. The construction and building industry, even just the materials like concrete are massive carbon emitters. Do you have any stats off the top of your head, or anything we can reference and fact check later on? But like how important from a climate change perspective is that we get this circular design and construction into a decarbonized future, essentially?
Yeah. So I mean, the building industry, I mean, we're often referred to as the 1/3 industry. So we're sort of accountable for roughly 1/3 of the emissions globally, roughly 1/3 of the waste production, and roughly 1/3 of the energy consumption. So obviously, being involved with the building industry, there's kind of a sense of responsibility of trying to change this and to sort of bring down emissions. And in the case of Quay Quarter Tower, the MP Tower in Sydney here, we actually saved 12,000 tons of carbon, which is sort of equivalent to 2,500 flights, Copenhagen to Sydney. So just to give it a bit of perspective, a fair bit of carbon saved from retaining the structure. And I think that's the general picture that we're seeing when we kind of run our carbon analysis on what we're doing, that if we are able to retain materials or structures, obviously we don't have to produce that anew out of virgin materials. So there's both a carbon saving in sort of the production of the building of materials, but there is also a resource, which is a different issue that we're facing, actually resource scarcity, right? So there has these two implications, or these two potentials, both sort of minimizing waste, but also minimizing carbon emissions. Yeah.
Now, at 3XN, you have this approach to design, which is to do circular design, behavioural design, and digital design. Can you just concretize what that means for us mere mortals?
Yeah. So obviously they're all kind of fairly broad concepts, but actually it was sort of our attempt to try to describe or put a lens on what it is it actually we see as major themes that are sort of influencing what we do. And if we start with the behavioral one, I find it quite interesting as an architect. I mean, I think the famous Danish architect Jan Gehl has a famous quote, and he says that we actually know more about gorillas' habitat in the jungle than we know about people in the urban environment, how we behave, what actually affects us. And I think that's kind of true. I mean, we actually don't know that much about how the built environment actually affects us, affects our behavior, affects our ability to either come together in kind of social synergy or the opposite. So we have quite a dedicated research approach to trying to understanding what does our project do to people. So we go back to the crime scene, you could say, and actually try to study, are the ways that we design the building, is it actually working as we thought it would? Because we always design with the user as the starting point. I mean, you might find some architects who are sort of saying, here's my brilliant sketch, make it happen, I like this form or whatever, but we always start with the user, and the user is what drives our design and the user experience. So we are trying to get smarter about, are the assumptions that we have when we design, are they actually true? And that means studying the buildings that we do from a kind of social and anthropological angle. So we employ researchers in doing that to inform ourselves. So that's the one thing.
And then, what are some tangible insights or foresights that you've derived from that sort of anthropological approach? Yeah,
sure. I mean, one thing that we always do a lot is we do these quite big sculptural stairs, and of course, a stair as an architectural element, it brings you from A to B, from one floor to the next. But a stair can be much more than that. It can be sort of a social furniture where you actually meet people that you didn't expect to meet. You can watch people from different parts of the building. So that's just one tangible element of architecture that we almost always employ to say, well, the stair brings together more than floors. It brings together people. It is a kind of social heart of a building. And we've done a lot of studies on how does that then actually work? What do people do? How do they behave at the landing of a stair versus on the steps and whatnot? So when we do a sculptural stair as an office, it's not just because we like doing sculptural forms. It is because we actually believe and can show through research that it has positive social effects, you could say. So that's one sort of specific element. Another element we're working a lot with is what you call the edge zones of buildings. How are you a good neighbor to what you're doing? How do you make sure that not just the users but also the passers-by have an opportunity to linger or to rest or to find respite within the building that you're doing. So the interface between any build project and the public realm is very important to us, and I think maybe it's very Scandinavian. I don't know, but we take that very seriously. That a building should give back something to the public realm. It should bring more than there was there before in terms of public benefits. So those are kind of I'd say fairly specific things. If we then talk about circular design, it is very much. I think we've been talking about sustainability for many years, and to me, circularity is sort of the transition to talking much about what you could call the materials economy. The fact that actually we should be focusing on resources and carbon and the way that we treat materials in our culture, because we are on a finite planet, and so it is really trying to sort of specifically address how we take materials, make something out of it, and how we leave that for the future generations. So it's really about how do we source materials, how do we put them together, how do we design things, and how do we enable future generations to assess these materials again, for them to sort of continuously be have resources available to them. And then digital design, or we also call it technology design sometimes, it's basically, I think you cannot, in the time that we're living in, you cannot not be engaged with technology somehow. It's affecting everything that we do. And for us specifically, it's a lot about how we actually work. How are we able to simulate things early in the design process? How can we get intelligence around what we do by including data? It's also increasingly how do the onslaught of digital technology affect how we engage with the built environment? I mean, it's actually... Some things are becoming non-physical, you could say, in a way. There are things that we do today like work that doesn't have to happen in a specific room. It can happen anywhere. How does that actually affect the rooms that we make, So that's a whole big topic that everyone is trying to grapple with, and we certainly also are in the built environment. But I think technology is affecting everything that we do, so it's kind of underpinning or underlying a lot of the solutions that we actually try to make. If we try to understand our carbon footprint as an office or as in a project, we are using technology to assess that. We're using technology to simulate that, right? So, yeah.
So because when I hear digital design, I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe it's smart buildings, etc. Is that part of it, or
it is part of
office
it,
of the future?
Yeah.
Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah,
on
no, it's for sure.
This big debate of hybrid workplace, or whether we're going to go back into the CBD and all these kind of things. Have you got
it's definitely
sense?
part of that, and it's also tightly connected to sustainability. I mean, how do your building perform? What is the technological systems that enables it to, minimize energy consumption or minimize water consumption or increase well-being? It's kind of all driven by technology, and certainly that whole post-COVID discussion on what is the office of the future is part of that. I think for me, it's when I think about work, and we do a lot of commercial projects, I mean, office buildings essentially, I think a big answer there is that it's not enough to have a lot of desks anymore. You need to have more, and a lot of that more is people actually being together, because a lot of the work you do, you can just do on your laptop from wherever, but you cannot meet with your team, you cannot meet with people, you cannot have that kind of social interaction over Teams, right? So the office of the future, or the office of now, needs to provide that in a good way, I think. So technology is not enough, but it's certainly a big topic for us, of course. Yeah.
You've talked a little bit about cognitive buildings. Can you just describe what that means and its impact on humans and the future of work?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as a concept, it is how do buildings learn, or how do you create buildings that are able to adapt to change? And I think it's both about technology, but it's actually also quite practical about how do you build buildings? Do you build buildings with the capacity to change? And it might seem a little bit abstract, but it is essentially, for example, I can mention in Key Quarter Tower, we have these atriums that are up to 8 or 9 floors, and the floor slab in that atrium is basically designed to be taken apart and moved around in the freight elevator, and that is done because which tenants will be there and how much floors they will have will change over time, right? But you'll always like to have that ability to have a shared amenity space across an organization where you can see each other and where you can kind of co-work. So it's building in that capacity to change when times are changing. And I think it's the same with technology. If we can build in the capacity to uptake better technology, or sort of change with the technological changes, well, then you have potentially a building which you never have to knock down, or you never have to sort of radically destroy, or because you have built in that kind of capacity to adapt. And that's sort of a cognitive building that can learn from its time and from the future. And I mean, we don't know what the future is. So what we can do is we can think about, how do you design for that sort of uncertainty? How do you build that in? So that's something I'm quite, it's quite close to us. We like to build in that sort of transformation capacity or adaptability to what we do. Yeah.
I mean, when I think about buildings and circular design, notions like biomimicry come up, and I think there's quite a famous example from Zimbabwe where when they wanted to build a new bank, one of the constraints was we don't want to put any air conditioning in it. So then they studied a termite stack and how that was structured. And as a result, the termites live in what is kind of the optimal environment for termites. But apparently it also just worked in terms of having this natural air conditioning, etc. And anyway, I don't know if it's an urban myth, this story, or not, true. But I'm curious, from a circular design perspective, biomimicry or otherwise, like, how is design or architecture inspired by nature? And what can we learn from having a kind of a closer human relationship with nature?
It's a great question, I think, and I actually think for there's probably for as long, at least for very long, been architect and designer who's been inspired by nature in terms of nature's forms and nature's expressions. You'll have architects like Gaudi in Spain who has all these amazing forms that kind of resemble natural structures. What I think is what we probably need to learn is exactly what you're saying, that the actual biomimicry in terms of understanding the systems, how do nature basically support itself, or how does nature actually work in closed loop systems? And that's a new thing for many, at least modern architects, I think. You'd probably have like more traditional vernacular architecture who naturally sort of works with the climate because they had to. They didn't have a lot of air conditioning units or available to them, right? So they had to work with that stuff. So, and we have to relearn that in a sense and kind of reintegrate ourselves into some of these systems. And I think I'm, for example, quite interested in how do we deal with water in the built environment. And I mean, nature has an amazing capacity to clean water naturally through different processes of kind of bacteria and sort of sediments that can clean water. And why shouldn't we, utilize that in the built environment? Do we need to have all kinds of big kit to deal with the water, or can we use nature? And I think for me, that's a kind of constant inspiration that we should seek to have. And the example from Zimbabwe is a great one. Look, how can you actually look at nature and learn from that, and that intelligence, not just from sort of a formalistic sort of point of view, but more like how does it actually work? How does nature clean water? How does nature regenerate itself? How does nature provide habitat for various species, right? And there's definitely a lot of inspiration that we can find there.
Mm. I mean, the notion of sort of green roofs and urban gardens and beehives on the roofs of buildings, that's been around for a little while. But like, can you just give us an example of how this approach to cleaning water might work in a CBD office building, for example?
Yeah, I mean,
and where would you utilize the water? Is it just for like an urban garden on the top, or what else can we do with it?
It could be, or it could be for it could be for washing toilets or shower or all kinds of things. I mean, we've done a couple of projects. We've done one in Denmark where we're using active algae to actually clean the water, and then it's recirculated back, and basically there's a 100% closed loop water system within the building. The great thing about these types of technologies, these types of ideas, is that you get the benefit of actually having nature in the city or in the built environment, right? Which you want. So it could be like green roofs that you're saying. Well, you get a better city out of it, but you also get the capacity to, in terms of green roof, it's kind of retaining water. So, and potentially collecting it and reusing it, so you don't have to kind of transport it too long and spend energy on that. So I think I'm quite interested in how do we make more local solutions for water, energy, biodiversity. How can each building, each part of a city be part of enhancing biodiversity, for example? Like how can we do that, and how can we kind of, as humans, actually get the benefit of that? I think most people like a green city. It's simply a better city. If you've been in a city where there's no greenery, it's not a very nice city. So I think it's about there's a kind of changing notion from greenery is a lawn that we can walk on to actually, greenery in a city can be something that enhances local biodiversity. It can be a green space for people, but it can also be something that caters to more species than just humans. And I think that's the kind of change in perception of what is the built environment actually supposed to do. It is actually supposed to be, hopefully, be part of solving some of the issues that we have, right? It needs to be, because we're so many people living in cities these days, right? So for me, the urban condition, or the city is ultimately a chance to be part of solving some of these things. For example, water scarcity or biodiversity crisis, because it's in the city. I think we can do it because we have the mass, and we have the kind of critical mass of people, in a sense, even though it's difficult.
And I mean, this is interesting, right? Because oftentimes, and throughout history, we've seen this, whether it's with pandemics or whether it's when cities get too polluted, that some people go, we're just going to move to the countryside. We'll have a tree change, a sea change. We'll go where the air is clean. And nowadays, though, the data seems to suggest that even with rates of urbanization around the world, that the most sustainable place you could actually live is in a city, because of the density, etc., and the opportunities for smart buildings and all the rest. And that actually moving to the countryside at this stage might not actually be a major contribution. It might be on the individual level that it might be a super, simple lifestyle and all the rest, and you're connected to the hobby farm or, a coast house or whatever it happens to be. Have you got any thoughts or reflections on that and how cities can play a role from a sustainability perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I certainly think that I understand people who move to the countryside. From a kind of personal perspective, it's a nice thing for sure. But I think cities there's a lot of things that can happen in cities that in relation to sustainability, which is quite important. And the density is sort of part of that. And I think we should probably be looking into a much more shared economy, sharing a lot more stuff, basically, producing a lot less, sharing a lot more. And in general, that is a lot easier to do in a city because you are close to each other, basically. And I can mention one example because I know it very well from myself, and that's, for example, car mobility, having your own car. And of course, if you live far from other people, you need to have a car. That's simply how it is, right? Or at least for a lot of people. I live in central Copenhagen, and it's a city where it's extremely convenient to bicycle. It's actually faster for me to take my bicycle around. It's also culturally acceptable. It's not like I'm the only one taking a bicycle. Everyone does it, so it's not like a statement or anything like that. It's just a culture that exists, right? And when I do need to have a car, share cars are extremely available to me. They're very close to where I live, and they have a dedicated parking space, and it's hell to find parking in central Copenhagen. So it is more efficient, it's more healthy, it's more convenient. It's cheaper, and it's culturally accepted. It's not, it's part of the culture. And I think in that small little example, it's actually the ingredients list for a lot of the changes that we probably need to make as sort of cultures. Like, how do we change as cultures? Well, I mean, most people are not going to do it if it's not convenient and if it's not good for them or good for their lives. So. I think it's interesting to look for how do you find that sweet spot between, yes, it's better for the environment that I don't have a car, but actually it's not necessarily why I do it.
I think the statistics in Australia is that the average car stands idle for 23 hours a day. So clearly there's some latent potential within that. I mean, I know from living in Surrey Hills for many years that GoGet was my go-to from a transport perspective, and it wasn't just an environmental choice. It was just like, well, it was on demand, it was super easy, could always find a parking spot no matter where I went, and even as we started having kids, it became an option for us because they were also cars geared towards families, etc., people movers, etc. So, it can work for different stages in life as well. But of course, some of those, collaborative consumption notions that you speak of, like a car sharing scheme, could it work out in Dubbo or in Wagga Wagga or in regional areas here in Australia, or is it just more challenging?
Yeah, it's probably more challenging, but I mean, I'm certainly not. I appreciate that there's also people who want to live in the country, and I think that's I completely understand that. So I do think. I mean, if you look at how a lot of more rural societies or communities used to work, at least in the parts of the world where I'm from, you would actually have a lot of space, but there would be certain things that you kind of bundle together and share, right? And you had something like the co-op union in Denmark, which is basically all the farmers coming together to share some of the production facilities. Even though they had their individual farms, they shared parts of the production facilities in order to sort of sell their milk, for example. And I think there's certainly also a kind of probably rediscovery of some of those synergies and sharing economies also in a rural setting. I would generally probably think that it's probably a bit easier for some of the things we talk about here in an urban environment because you're just more people to share something and it has more scale. But I think probably the same ideas should be employed in more rural settings. But obviously you're right. I mean, if you have to walk 10 kilometers to get your sharing car, it might not be that attractive, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, you got other mobility solutions here, like Car Next Door. Here on the northern beaches up on the peninsula, there's not as many go-gets. There's a few scattered in various places like Mona Vale and Dee Why and Brookvale and all the rest. But I guess the rates and incidence of car ownership is high here. But people have done this sort of neighborly swapping schemes like Car Next Door, where you're essentially just borrowing someone else's car for a few hours and you can book those in. They don't seem to have reached sort of mass adoption yet, but they are around. You mentioned moving to the country a moment ago. We've talked a fair bit about Denmark, but if we just go back to your childhood, what childhood experiences in Denmark have influenced your design thinking, and any anecdotes that that you're happy to share?
Yeah, sure. I can. I mean, I think I grew up in sort of the suburbs and in a kind of green environment. A lot of nature around me, and I certainly think that kind of inspired me quite a lot. I think as a society, probably in Denmark, I think if I should say something that kind of inspired me as a designer, as an architect, it is a pretty you could say equal society and a kind of socially oriented society, as probably many people will know. And I think the Danish design tradition is very much that you're actually doing stuff for people that are solving problems for them. You're trying to use your design and your creativity to solve problems and to make everyday life for the ordinary person better. And I think that's probably my design philosophy as well. I think I would like to try to solve problems for people and make people's lives better. So it's not so much about, I hope, not so much about me or my ego or my kind of desire to express something. It is more actually about trying to use creativity to solve issues for people. And then you can say there are stuff that I like from maybe a kind of aesthetic perspective. I like natural materials. I like things that are not like that are what they seem to be, that are honest, which I think is probably again part of the maybe the design tradition. You'd rather just see a material as it is and see the beauty of that instead of kind of trying to cover it up. If I should mention kind of one experience or one memory that I have a kind of a strong recollection of lying in my parents' garden and kind of looking up at the trees and the kind of birch trees and the light coming through the leaves. And that was always kind of a very strong image for me that has a lot to do with architecture and space, actually. I think you're lying underneath a tree, you're sort of in a space, you have daylight coming down in a sort of very specific kind of shimmering way, and you are feeling comfortable in a sort of a soft lying on the grass. And I think that notion of space where you're outside, but you feel as if you're sort of protected or covered is probably a very basic notion of what architecture can be. And I think a lot of good architecture it is this safe shelter for humans, but it is in close relation to the outside and to nature and to daylight, essentially.
I mean, in Scandinavia, we're obviously spoilt with sunlight in summertime, and then it's a very scarce resource in winter. So I'm curious that sort of example of the birch tree and the filtered light coming through, and like, is that something that you've been able to translate or have seen examples of that being translated into buildings, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think working with daylight as a resource, as something you always like to have somehow. And of course, you're right that there's in different climates there's different kind of approaches to how you deal with daylight. And it's also a sustainability example. The more natural light, the less electric light you need, right? But I think I can mention one project that I was part of in Denmark, where we did these big skylights. We got a lot of light down into sort of a conference space, and there we used PVs to sort of make this kind of shimmering effect. So on one hand, the light was kind of coming through the glass, but at the same time, parts of it was kind of reflected by solar PVs, so solar cells. So it was producing energy, clean energy at the same time. So you got this kind of ornament of the solar cells kind of drawing patterns on the floor. You have the daylight, so you have this kind of, for me, a strong kind of synthesis between technology, a kind of green technology, and a kind of architectural experience, daylight. So for me, that's a kind of a strong example of what I guess I'd like to try to do as an architect, to make that kind of synthesis between outside and inside, and a more, let's call it sustainable or kind of climate conscious way of using materials and technology. Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful examples of, seeing that birch tree leaves in action to a degree, in a very, digitally transformative, but also, very sustainable fashion as well. So that's an interesting example of sort of your design thinking at play. I'm wondering, like, whether it's Sydney Fish Market, you've mentioned the building in Circular Quay, the old AMP building. Can you give us any other numbers on the sort of climate positive outcomes of buildings that either inspire you or you have been responsible for at 3XN?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe it's good to talk a bit about the fish market because it's actually kind of my baby as a project. It's one of my favorite projects.
And one that all Sydney-siders are excited about.
I hope so much that people will enjoy it. I think that's probably a project that speaks a lot about our kind of design approach as a studio. I mean, if any of you have kind of seen the image of it, it is this kind of massively big undulating roof scape that is kind of covering the upper ground floor with all the retailers, and then you have the lower ground floor with the wholesale and the auction. And it's actually one big public space. It's kind of a sweeping movement from the sort of walk along the water and up into the upper ground floor with the kind of big public stairway. But actually, the way that the roof is done is primarily driven actually by environmental concern. It might look like a very funky, maybe even kind of almost like a stingray, which is of course great, but it's done in a way. The reason behind the form is first of all, it lives up where there needs to be sort of additional programs. So there's some kind of mezzanines with the cooking school and whatnot. But actually, what it also does is it's shaped in a way so in two wells it collects all the water that hits on the roof. It's a massive roof. I think it's like 2 Anfield, if that means anything to anyone. It's like 2 big soccer references here. So it's a massive roof, and there's when, as you will know better than me, when it rains in Sydney, you sometimes get these real pours. So there's a lot of water falling on that roof, and they do spend a lot of water inside the fish market. So all the water that is coming that lands on the roof will be collected in 2 kind of pits and then taken down and recycled within. So at the same time, the hoods of the roof, the hoods it has these kind of pointy hoods elements, and they are close towards north, where you have the sun in Sydney, and it's cladded with solar cells, so it will produce energy, and it's open towards south, so you get the indirect daylight down into the fish market. So you, on one hand, you'll produce energy, but you'll also get that kind of natural light down, and at the same time, it's oriented so that it kind of catches the prevailing wind, so you get a kind of natural ventilated space underneath. And actually, when we received the brief for the fish market, it was described as one sort of a box, sort of a conditioned box, basically like a shopping mall. And we were quite clear through our design that we thought it would be great to utilize the great climate that you have here in Sydney to create an actual authentic market experience that would at the same time minimize resource consumption, essentially. And for the fish market, I think, if I remember correctly, we will reduce the water consumption. I think it's by 70%, based on the baseline of what they're spending today.
Yeah.
So fairly significant.
So not just on the expense side, but you're actually harvesting the rainwater.
Yes, we're recycling water, and of course we're also putting in more efficient kit than they have now. So it'll be much more water efficient in that way. I believe it is around 70% that we are reducing that. I cannot remember the energy consumption, how much it is, but it is also a pretty high number that we're reducing based on more passive systems and having the PVs on the roof. I guess it just goes to say that we try to find this linkage between what we consider to be good design, but driven by environmental concerns, essentially, right? So it's not because we want it to look like a stingray, it's because it actually does something, it performs in a certain way. And then it ends up looking in a way that we obviously find aesthetically pleasing as well.
Yeah, and no fishy smells around either.
Let's see, but hopefully not.
I mean, we're living in a, I'm not talking necessarily about fish smell here, but in a polluted world, partly fired by or energized by coal-fired power plants. Sadly, you've created the Airbird at GXN and 3XN, which is sort of inspired by the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine, but also how it's sort of inspired one of your, I guess, retrofitted or integrated sensors in buildings?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, maybe for people who don't know about sort of the canary in the coal mine, coal miners back in the day used to bring down a small canary bird because it would chirp, and if kind of toxic gases that you don't sense while you're down there, if they the levels became too high, well, then it would stop chirping, and they would know now it's time to get out. And we sort of used that metaphor for modern day schools and offices, where actually a lot of indoor environments have major problems with CO2 levels, for example. And it's a little bit the same. You don't notice, you're like the frog in the boiler, right? You don't really notice it, but actually your cognitive function weakens. You could become tired, you fatigue. So especially in schools, for example, in some schools, it's a pretty big issue that actually kids are, they're learning less because of the indoor environment, and they're having health issues due to that. So it was kind of a product that we developed together with partners in Denmark, kind of a company called Liebkräfter and a company called Velux, the big sort of manufacturer of windows, to do sort of an indoor air quality nudge, you could say, but in a friendly design. So we designed a small sensor as it is. It looks like a bird, kind of aesthetically pleasing bird, let's say, that you can hang on the wall or put on your table. But what it does is, at certain CO2 thresholds that you can set, it chirps. So when you go above a certain threshold, it makes a chirping sound, and that is then meant to nudge people to either open the window, relocate, do small things to improve their own indoor environment, essentially. And we've tested it out in quite a few schools, and it's been quite a good story for the kids, because it's a friendly product. I mean, I think if you put up a sensor, it will be a little bit more sort of maybe alienating to a lot of people. But because it has this kind of bird look and something that's nice to touch and so on, it almost becomes like a friendly classroom pet that sort of enables them to kind of improve on their own well-being, essentially. So I guess it's an example of trying to marry technology and sort of indoor climate concerns with each other in a way where design becomes the sort of facilitator for that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and a nice sort of cap nod to coal mining history, but also how it integrates with nature and what intelligence nature can actually have towards toxicity and other concerns, and how the interplay between human and nature is played out in the past and also in the future. What do you think it is about the Scandinavian or the Danish approach to architecture, design, that wins Australian hearts and minds? And what can this nation of Australia learn from the Nordics from a sustainability perspective? I ask you as we sit here in front of like all these Danish art pieces, by the way.
Yeah, I feel right at home here. It's great. There's a good history of sort of, especially Sydney, sort of embracing Danish architecture, of course, from Jørgen Utzon and the Opera House, but also Jan Gehl, who I know, he's not as famous, but he's an urban thinker from Denmark who wrote the book Cities for People, who is basically sort of a protest against modernist city planning or urban planning, saying, well, we are planning everything for cars, we should be planning for people. And his thinking, I think, has influenced a lot of people in Australia and in Sydney as well. And I guess what I hear from why people like to work with us as kind of foreigners coming, now we are actually locals, because our studio in Sydney is a full-fledged studio with lots of Australians working there. But when we started working here, I think what we understood to be the quality is, one, that we probably bring a certain set of kind of embodied values to everything that we do. I think it's pretty embodied in Scandinavian culture. Some of the stuff I talked about before, well, you're actually trying to design for people, design for users. You're not a star architect trying to sort of And then there's been a point in time in architectural history where you wanted that star quality, you wanted that big architect coming in with the fantastic idea, whereas we are sort of, I guess, much more process oriented, and we will listen to people and we'll work with people, and I think that's the feedback we're getting, that we're easy to work with, and we listen to the people that we're working with. So I think there's a cultural piece where maybe some parts of the world, and maybe Australia, is looking to Scandinavia for some of the solutions to how can you maybe have a more socially oriented development in buildings and in cities. And then on the other hand, it's actually the people and the culture of an office that's not only comprised of Danish people, by the way. We are a very international office. I think we have 22 nationalities working at the office. But maybe there is at the root of that, there is maybe a Scandinavian culture. I think there is a Scandinavian culture of collaboration and curiousness and non-hierarchical, I'd like to think, way of working where the best idea wins and you actually listen to people, which I think a lot of people, we're good to work with in that sense.
So it's not just the fact that the only Australian royal lives in Copenhagen.
That might help too. Might help too. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. Proud history of Danish Australian marriages,
Yes.
literally and metaphorically. What are your mentors or inspirations in the circular economy space? And I guess building on that, what resources can entrepreneurs or creatives, change agents, mere mortals, humans, check out to help them evolve from a sort of linear economy thinking to more of a circular economy of thinking?
For me, I'm going to mention some of the kind of old heroes that inspired me maybe 10, 15 years ago, and that's people like Bill McDonough and Michael Braungart, who wrote Cradle to Cradle, the book on Cradle to Cradle, and we worked with them on translating some of their philosophy into the built environment. They inspired me a lot when I first read the book, because they were the first that I read to sort of put a language to a system that looks radically different than the system we have today, without sort of just only talking about all the stuff we need to reduce and all the stuff we need to not be doing, but more about where are we actually supposed to go somehow. Which I found very inspiring, and kind of from that, there are Dame Ellen MacArthur, who was the sort of founder or initiator of the circular economy movement, and
Ellen MacArthur Foundation,
exactly, which is a very inspiring speaker and writer too. And increasingly in these last years, I'm sort of reading a lot about degrowth as a concept, how will that work, and increasingly also some of the sociologists who are talking about. Writing about a new ecological class. How do you create a cultural, social movement that enable all of us to change culture, which is certainly not an easy thing to do. But some of those thoughts are kind of inspiring me, and for the life of me, I can't remember the names right now. Maybe we can link to it. But I mean, I think that for people who haven't read it, I'd encourage everyone to read sort of Cradle to Cradle, Remaking the Way We Make Things. It's a very philosophical book, and I think it's still valid today, even though it's 20-something years old.
Yeah, cool. We'll put that in the show notes to the second Renaissance as well. We met sort of fortuitously via the Cape Mackerel Cabin, our little Airbnb, my very Swedish-inspired summer house at Mackerel Beach here in Sydney. It's a little ode to the Stockholm archipelago that I'm trying to recreate here in Australia. Now, Australia's coastline, including Mackerel Beach, is being battered by rising sea levels, coastal erosion, more frequent floods, landslides, including near our property at Mackerel Beach. These things are becoming more common, and houses, property are taking a beating at the moment. How can circular architecture help mitigate against climate risk? Not just in the big cities, but also just in terms of how climate ready people are in terms of just their primary housing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great place you have there on Mackerel Beach, by the way. Amazing place.
Welcome back anytime.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, without being any kind of expert on kind of coastal erosion or especially in Australia, I think a general thing that I believe it's a kind of right approach is that climate is changing, and we need to design with that and not against that. And that means, for example, raising sea levels and increased precipitation. And I think generally, what I would call nature-based solutions are the way to go. So when we have increased rainfall in our cities and in our everywhere, instead of building bigger sewers, we should be thinking about where do we allow the water to run? Can we have seasonal lakes? Can we have sort of nature-based solutions where overflow areas, wetland areas, where the water can go when there's too much of it, and then it can go away when there's not that much of it? And the same with I think with coastal protection. Can we create solutions based on kind of natural, instead of building big, concrete walls to keep out the water or to keep the soil in? We should probably generally be looking at, well, for example, if you talk about soil, are there things you can plant which roots net will in time, improve what we're seeing here? Or are there things you can do in the water in terms of letting, some of the water come in specific places or stuff like that? And in terms of how we build, I think we probably in some areas we will probably have to build houses that can float or are standing on stilts or things like that, right? To build with it, because it's certainly an issue. And I think in general, my approach would be that we need to design with that fact and not think that we can keep it out, because that's probably in the bigger picture the wrong attitude. I think we need to design with it somehow. So maybe it's not a very specific practical question to how you deal with kind of landslides in Australia. I'm no expert there, but I mean, my general approach would be that of sort of nature-based solutions.
Yeah, I mean, certainly up at Mackerel Beach, I mean, we do our best. We harvest rainwater, so all the water we drink is from the sky, filtered 4 or 5 times. But that's what we would use in the garden as well, and all the rest. And then we have an independent sewage system, for example, which lots of microbial or microbacterial activity going on there, but it also becomes fantastic fertilizer, for example. So we are trying to work with nature there, and certainly in terms of plant landscape, etc., using natives, etc., to make sure that hopefully we can prevent future landslides as well.
Yeah, but that's
I'm just thinking, like, when you think about the future and what the built environment, your designs, other designers can contribute at 3XN, GXN, like what sort of sustainable legacy do you want to leave to your children, but also the next generation of humans in a hopefully better tomorrow?
It's a great question and a big question as well. I mean, I guess I hope for myself and for the company I'm part of that probably the best thing we can do is to inspire people, I think, because certainly not one project and one company is going to solve the issues that we have in front of us. But I do hope that we can be part of inspiring more people to sort of engage with the issues we have around climate change and the sort of sustainability, achieving sustainability. I guess where I see my hope or my role is that I can be a small part of creating sort of a movement wherein these things become not obstacles for us, but actually a new chance to put meaning and ethos into what we do as designers or architects or anyone, basically. Educating people or telling people or giving people knowledge is also part of that. We sort of all are trying to do our little part in understanding the new paradigm that we are hopefully and we have to move into. And I hope in terms of my kids and my legacy that I'll have played kind of a small part in that, of creating and defining that movement and giving it form, because that's what I then do as an architect, right?
Are there any like practical tips that people, Aussies, whether you have, a big sort of portfolio of, buildings, or if you even just thinking about your own home, either as a tenant or as a homeowner, like, and you're thinking about renovations or retrofitting, etc., like, are there some simple things maybe a homeowner or even a tenant, a renter, can do to think about circularity, and any resources they should be thinking about if they ever have plans for renovations or improvements?
Yeah, I think in general, very generally speaking, I mean, you could say materials that are natural, that are without toxic chemistry and without sort of generally not treated with all kinds of funky chemistry are the best to use. If it come from natural renewable sources, you are likely in a good place. So
An
that's
example being Tasmanian oak, for example.
There you go. Right, exactly. A regenerative material, locally sourced, probably locally manufactured. I mean, stuff like that is sort of a good general rule. I think if I should say anything to sort of the people out there or general persons around, what probably the biggest impact in terms of sustainability that a one person can have, I actually think, and for many it's like, yes, it's great to recycle, it's great to eat less meat, it's great if you can drive less and all that, but actually where you put your money, where you invest your money is probably the biggest impact you can have. If you have any money and you are putting them somewhere in a bank or a financial institution, you should try to see where they can do most value in terms of the transition that we're doing, because that's actually, as a private person with some means, obviously, that's probably the biggest thing you can do, I would say. That's actually thinking about what are your money actually spent for on a kind of larger, how are your money being invested or how are they being used? And there are banks and institutions that are much more better than others. So without kind of being an expert on the Australian market, I think that would be that's what I think about myself. How can I actually put the money that are the funds that I have available to me into something that is driving the world in a better direction?
Yeah, we had a great episode on this show with John Treadgold, who's in social impact investing, ESG investing. So if any of the viewers and listeners want to dig deeper into this really important topic, they can do that on the Second Renaissance as well. But I guess the question there is like, where is your dollar best spent and how climate change ready is that dollar? So whether it's your mortgage or your deposit or your savings, your superannuation, is it being invested in or funding, say, fossil fuels,
exactly.
as opposed to maybe the industries of the future?
Exactly.
Lasse, thank you for rebuilding and designing a better future and more aesthetically pleasing future for all of us here in Sydney, but also for some of your other really great international work. It's been a pleasure meeting you face to face, and welcome back to Avalon, and certainly to Cape Mackerel Cabin anytime as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
For more information about the Second Renaissance and our work on sustainable innovation, please visit my website, www.sorman-Nilsson.com. We would appreciate if you can take a moment to share the podcast with a friend or a colleague and help build the movement. We hope that what we learn together on the Second Renaissance can help us all build a sustainable future for ourselves and our children. See you in the near future.